So these are our notes for 6th hour for making up from the storm and the lockdown and everything else for February 6th and 7th, so to speak. So this is going to be catching up with where 3rd hour is. So we've talked today about gender roles. Or briefly started talking about gender roles, how they're changing with women now having the right to vote, but a lot of other things are happening too. So we're looking at now women in the home and labor force. The traditional separation of labor continued. Middle-class women still expected to stay home. Were still expected to stay home with the family. So middle-class women and higher were still expected to be staying at home with their kids, not finding a job at this point. I want to say the percentage of women working this time is like 20-30%, so it's still fairly low. Whatever the pre-war numbers were for women working, it's the same as it is in the 1920s. So the war was kind of a fluke just for the war itself. But their life at home has changed because we've already mentioned the labor-saving devices, things like washing machines, vacuums, irons, and so forth, make their lives a whole lot easier on a day-to-day basis. And so home life is changing for a lot of women because it's getting easier, and because it's getting easier with these appliances, they're having more free time and more social time. So all women, no matter what their social standing, pretty much, are experiencing more social times as a result, or social activities. They can join bridge club, they can join some kind of volunteer organization, they can join a gardening club, whatever the case is. In the workforce, like we said, women pretty much the same numbers as before the war. Women were still getting employed in jobs in cities like for clerks or secretaries or nurses or teachers, housekeepers. So still very much women-type jobs in the 1920s. But you are steadily seeing more women increasing. So the number is increasing slowly but surely. But women are still limited in what they can do. And of course, they're getting paid less than men still. So women are still getting paid less than men as well. Probably one of the more famous things that happens to women in the 1920s is this revolution in morals, a revolution in how women start behaving. The most significant change for men and women in the 20s is the revolt against sexual taboos. Coming out of the 1800s, you're going through what's called the Victorian era. In the Victorian era in the 1800s, in Europe, England, as well as here, it's just a lot of sexual repression. There just wasn't any kind of encouragement at all whatsoever of expression of your dating or anything else. There wasn't a lot of talk about sex or anything like that at all. One of the guys who helps kind of make a change here is Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud, one of the first psychologists of the modern time who helped develop psychoanalysis, does a lot of research into stressing how sexual repression does a lot to hurt you and hurt you psychologically. That people should be more open with their sexuality and dating and so forth. And that happens here after the war because with more people living in cities and less strict morals, people in cities, especially in urban areas, are more willing to embrace not so intense sexual repression. And they're more willing to have a more casual dating type experience. So there are people in cities in America who take the premarital sex like it's a new invention in this time period. So there are a lot of people who are having much more casual open dating and premarital sex than ever before. And you see sex emphasized in a lot of different areas. Movies, obviously you have movie stars now. People become obsessed with celebrities. You have novels that deal with sexuality. Automobiles, of course, like we talked about, the dating culture with automobiles. That all is part of it as well, too. Dances become part of this as well. Two famous dances from the 1920s are like the Foxtrot and the Charleston. And I actually showed 3rd hour some videos of this if you want to go look at it. But these videos on the Foxtrot or Charleston demonstrate how how things are a bit more sexualized for the time period. Which you go look at it now, it's nothing like you would think. It's not what we consider sexualized at all. But back then, the way people were dressing, the way women were behaving now, became a lot more sexualized. Birth control was still illegal in a lot of different states, so most states still had birth control illegal. One person who stood up against this was Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger was an early feminist who spoke out for the use of birth control for women, who tried to lobby states to get it to be legal. She's also was one of the founders. She's also one of the people who goes on to found what is now Planned Parenthood. So she's also one of the founders, or considered to be the founders, of Planned Parenthood today. But Margaret Sanger is a name you may want to be aware of from the 1920s as far as fighting for women's body equality in this time period. So morals are relaxing, especially in the cities. Like I said, rural areas not so much, but at least here. And the most famous example of this would be the flapper look, which I have some pictures of here, which I don't know how well you can see. But the flapper look is one of those looks that defines an era. We have a lot of people who wear Halloween costumes with it now and stuff, but it's not what you probably think it is exactly now. So for that time, it is a bit more sexualized. It's a dress that goes to the knees. The dress is usually not form-fitting, so it does not accentuate womanly features. You have a short bob haircut, so you have a short haircut. A lot of times they'd also wear these close, tight-knit hats, as you see here in these various pictures here too. But it was actually a very boyish look. So they wore these clothes that were not very feminine, and they wore a short haircut because they're trying to look more boyish. They're trying to basically move away from these very womanly type dresses that would accentuate tight waists, the breasts, and so on. And the dresses would go down to their feet, and they would not expose any kind of things that would be considered sexual. But now you have women who are wearing these boots up to their ankles or having dresses go down to their knees, and they consider to be a lot more sexualized than they were before. So they're challenging their gender norms for the time period. Now you got to think, who would be doing this? It's not going to be average women or every woman. It's going to be young women. So mostly young women living in cities are the ones wearing the flapper look. So 20, 30-year-olds are the ones who be wearing this kind of style, which is why if you see The Great Gatsby, it's, you know, a lot of these people are wearing in that time period. But you know, today it kind of gets a little bit too over-sexualized. You see a lot of like modern-day flapper costumes. It's a little bit too tight or too short for what they had back in those days. But in that time period, this is the kind of outfit that, you know, they're kind of rebelling against their the ways they were told to dress before this. So along with jazz music, the flapper look was a type of rebellion for young people to wear. Of course, you know, older people, just like now, would not wear the same kind of outfits that you wear, so same thing for the flapper look. It's mostly young people wearing this type of style. The problem with this is that there was also a double standard. You know, women at this point were smoking cigarettes in public, driving cars. They were doing more socializing with boys, and, you know, men liked it, but there was a double standard here. That men would be okay dating a flapper, but they didn't want to marry a flapper. And so that became a double standard, that men would date around, but it was not the kind of woman they wanted to date, where, you know, women might want to get married at some point, but it's, you know, that they were not as easily getting the man if they might embrace some of these changes. And you see that double standard even now. You know, I gave this analogy to third hours by saying, you know, today it's like if a junior, you know, if a junior male today at a high school dated 3 girls, nothing sexual, just dated 3 girls, he'd be looked at as like, you know, a normal guy or a stud or whatever. But if a girl dated 3 guys in a year, she'd be looked at, you know, not as well as the guy would, right? So it's just, there's still a double standard even now with these ideas about what women and men can and can't do. So that's how morals are changing. And then you look at divorce. Divorce was becoming more common because of women's suffrage. Women had a voice now in politics, and so lawmakers now had a list of feminists because now they vote. And so women began to demand changes to these divorce laws and marriage laws in states to make it easier for women to get out of an abusive or incompatible relationship with a husband. So, you know, if you have a bad relationship, it'd be a lot easier now to get out of it with a divorce. As a result, by 1930, 1 out of 6 marriages end in divorce. So 1 out of 6 marriages end in divorce because of this. And if you want to know what today's is 1 out of 2. But back then at 1930, it'd be 1 out of 6. And for education, more people in more states believed that education was very valuable, and they wanted kids to be in education. So more states began to enact compulsory school laws where they had to be in school. Now you're beginning to see more schools requiring you go into like middle school age, but more schools are requiring kids to go to school longer and stay in school longer as a result. By the end of the 1920s, the number of high school graduates doubled to 25%. So by the late 20s, by 1930 or so, the number of high school graduates doubles to about 25%. So high school is still not mandatory, but you're seeing more and more people attend high school as a result. So that's your education. Then you have literature of alienation. This is the post-war literature period where it's very much defined by the war itself. A lot of these writers, the literature of alienation, scorn religion as hypocritical, and they condemn the sacrifices of World War I as a fraud. Probably one of the more famous writers is Ernest Hemingway, who served in the war, who was a veteran of the war, and very much affected by it. So he criticized the notions of God and religion. He criticized the ideas of noble fighting in the war, that he basically said there's nothing noble about this war at all whatsoever. So a lot of his works are very famous about the war itself and about his themes concerning the war and being disconcerted with a lot of the higher morals that people had before this time period. Another writer named Gertrude Stein was the one who called these writers the lost generation, because some of these writers were affected by the war, and so these writers are also known as the lost generation writers because of the influence of the war itself. Some famous American writers were F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote The Great Gatsby, Ernest Hemingway, Sinclair Lewis, T.S. Eliot. All these guys became very disillusioned with the world and how things were as a result. And they didn't also like consumerism. So these guys were also big-time critics of consumerism of the 1920s and didn't like how much people were concerned with buying stuff and buying things all the time and having this and having that. A lot of them drank heavily. Hemingway drank heavily. Some of them went to live in Europe. But these are some of the things that he discussed. Most famously, you have The Great Gatsby, which you're going to read this year in English class. But The Great Gatsby is often considered to be this great American novel, but it does do a good job of kind of explaining problems with the 1920s. So the story, to kind of give you a summary, because you are going to read this year, you're going to read the book this year in English, so I don't want to give too much away. But it's about this millionaire named Jay Gatsby who has all these lavish parties and all this money, and the whole time he's trying to woo this guy's wife named Daisy Buchanan. He's trying to impress her. So the message kind of becomes this very anti-materialism message, like we talked about, how it's, these things don't make you happy. They just make you, you can have all this money and wealth and you can have all these items, but it still doesn't make you a satisfied person. And so it really becomes a big criticism of materialism as a result. This book cover you see here was actually a designated book cover that was made for the original publication. So that's why every copy of The Great Gatsby since then has had like this same picture on it, because it was a painting commissioned for this book way back when. All right, so the last thing for this video is going to be the art. Before we go to video 2, the art, just want to mention real quick, also influenced by the war as well. For architecture, Frank Lloyd Wright was still around. He's still doing architecture where form follows function. Some of his famous buildings are in New York in this time period. And you have your famous artists. Artists were also very critical of new technology and urban life and so forth. And so you have famous painters like Edward Hopper and Georgia O'Keeffe. You can see Edward Hopper's painting here, which is this famous painting of this diner corner, and Georgia O'Keeffe here as well. So again, they're kind of disillusioned with some of the materialism of the day too, and technology, and it's very isolated, very alienated as well, just like literature is too. So you see some artwork here as well. So that's where video 1's going to stop, and we're going to have video 2, and that'll be it for the notes.